One of the most important parts of music is the bass. There are many different types of basses, particularly synth basses, that are used across a number of different styles and genres of music. And here's 5 ways to synth bass. Let's get into it. We're going to start simple. This is about as simple as a synth bass can get, using just a sawtooth wave or a pulse wave, and a filter. Now for a sound like this, we want to have the cutoff relatively low so that we're only really listening to the lower frequencies of the sound. And for this, key tracking the filter is even more important because we do want to keep the lower notes to be a little more mellow than some of the other instruments that are going to be in your mix. And if we have the tracking all the way up, what this does, at least here, is that the filter will open up all the way with the higher notes. So we can hear that here. What I like to do is I like to have the tracking be a little under 50 so that it's not as bright across the entire sound. I also have a bit of modulation in the filter and with a bit of decay so that it is bright at the beginning near the attack and then comes back down a little later. We can extend that. You can add resonance for something really funky. And even change the decay of the filter so that the bass sounds really snappy. Of course, the filter doesn't have to be that low. If you want a brighter, harsher sounding bass, you can add a bit of cutoff. You can have more than one oscillator for a bass sound, but you don't want to detune them too much because you don't want to deal with phase cancellation, especially with those lower frequencies. But if you open up the filter, you can have a brighter sound. It doesn't have to be something with only a quick decay. You can extend the decay longer so that it fades out a little more. Here's one with pulse only, with a little bit of pulse width. A sub bass. Now this next sound you could do a number of different ways. One of the ways that you could do it is to use mostly a sine wave because it is as fundamental of a waveform as you can get. But you can get close to something like that would work using a subtractive synth. So what we're going to do with this is turn the tracking all the way up because we're also going to increase the resonance. Bring the modulation down. Listen to the sawtooth wave. And we can hear here that there are frequencies that are being emphasized, but we want to make sure that the resonance matches the note frequency so that it will sound sine wave-like. And that sub bass sounds like this. And that sub bass sounds like this. Now, of course, with a sound like this, we could open up the filter just a little bit and reduce some of the resonance so that we have some frequencies above the note that we're playing. Something like that. And it's also a little bit softer, so that if we were to increase the volume, we still get some other overtones in this sound. We could do the same thing with a pulse wave here. Very deep. The closest wave that we have to sounding like a sine is a triangle. FM. Just like with a lot of different sounds, FM can get you a wide range of different bass sounds. Right here in front of me is another simple bass sound you might recognize from a DX-like synthesizer, where different oscillators are going to be modulating others and creating a new sound. For instance, what I have here are 3 different sine waves. What we're hearing is the bottom one. Sounds like a sine wave. But then we have this, which is another sine wave. And it's going to modulate this a bit, and you see how the waveform is changing. The sound is going to be this. It's tuned to pretty much the same tuning as the carrier wave, with a little bit of detuning. But if I change it to this, I get more of a square wave type sound. But I also have this last one, and sometimes there will be an oscillator tuned to a very high pitch. And this gives very, very high harmonics to the sound. Very DX7-like. Then there are also basses like this. Quick modulation and very, very tight with the decay of the second waveform here going into the first one. And instead of having a 1-to-1 ratio, it's a 1 to 2.5. So on its own, 2.5 is an octave and a major third, but because the modulator here is tuned to 1, it's modulating the carrier wave here just enough that we hear the lower note. And that's the effect that it has. The third oscillator up here adds a little bit more to the sound. It's tuned to 3. And it's kind of square-like, but a bit different. Of course, many of you might recognize this type of sound because FM can be used for this as well. With this, we have a carrier wave right here, which is just a sine wave being modulated by a triangle wave. This oscillator up here, that's also a triangle wave that's tuned to 10, has the envelope so that it has an immediate attack and then a gradual decay, whereas the second triangle wave ramps up. And so that's why we have a very bright sound at the beginning, and then the rest of the sound comes in. And then to add in some more of the fundamental, we have a sawtooth wave that is filtered down here, which is also just slightly modulating the carrier wave right here. Resynthesis. Now this is going to be a little bit interesting. So with bass sounds, you could have them so that they're closer to the fundamental wave, but you can also have sounds that have quite a bit of harmonic overtones, like with the FM examples that I showed earlier. Resynthesis is converting a sample to a synthesizer wave. And what's cool about resynthesis is that it forces pretty much all the sound in whatever sample it is into the key that you're playing in. So let's say I play a C, like this. If I were to put a sample that had some noise or multiple notes or multiple tones in it, it's still going to try and force it to be a C if I play a C, instead of just turning the sample into like some weird glitchy kind of distorted version of the original sample, in which it will still kind of sound like it, but not. And so in this example, I'm going to do that with a completely different sample that isn't related to a bass at all, and turn it into a bass. I'm converting this sample into a bass. So far it sounds like this. And you can hear how it still has a lot of this weird, I guess, interpolation of the noise that's in the sample, because it's a very noisy sample, and it's very stuttery. But it is trying to force it into a note. And so what I'm going to do, at least here in Faceplant, is just select some points, some key points in this, and I'm going to turn that into a wave. I like that wave. Now down here I have an envelope, and it's tracking the position of the wavetable, and so I can pull this down so I can get it to start with a little bit more of an attack. It's actually not bad of a bass sound, but that originally came from a piano. And that could work with, say, let me go with something maybe a little bit more extreme. What if I were to use water? Yeah, what if I used water? Ooh. It might not work, but we probably could. Just find some points in here to get some interesting waveforms. And then all we have to do is convert it, and we have an interesting waveform. Changing the position of the wavetable again. It still works as a bass. It also works because it's a very low-pitched sample. Anything that is in the lower range or the bass range should presumably work. But yeah, even a sample of water splashing can turn into a bass with resynthesis. Ain't that cool? Just use effects. If you're ever in a pinch, you could just use distortion and a waveform, and that could be your bass. Right now, I've got a sine wave with just a little bit of self-feedback, but not that much feedback, just a little bit right around here, going into a filter with a little bit of resonance, because that's going to go through this distortion. I have some foldback, which is giving it some harmonics. Much like a real bass would be plugged into an amp and have a lot of that overdrive there. Maybe not this much, but still, you get the picture. If I want to shape the sound even more, add something like a resonator. Maybe also a comb filter. If you want to get even crazier, there's also phase distortion, at least here in Faceplant there is. I brought it into the territory of it almost sounding FM again. This might be the worst way to do it because I cannot get rid of that clicking, so maybe this method is ultimately a last resort. But yeah, that's 5 ways to synth bass. Those are the sounds. See you in another video. Bye.